Hello and welcome to the Down Under Visa Philippines to Australia podcast series. I'm your host, Jeff Harvey, registered migration agent with Down Under Visa, the premier Australian migration agent in Manila, Philippines, specialising in visas for Australian Filipina couples. We hope you enjoy this podcast and hope it proves useful to you. Please feel free to share this with your partner and with any of your interested friends. Let's get started. Australian Filipina relationship problems, nationalism and taking things personally. Here's Jeff Harvey again going for the long title championship. It was nearly worse before I decided to leave out the word generalising. I will no doubt cover that word though, as I try to explain an area that only the brave and foolhardy will ever attempt. Now with that in mind, can readers please try not to take anything I say personally, either as individuals or on behalf of your fellow countrymen and women. Glad we got that covered. Now I was on a Facebook group the other day that I frequent. Now there happened to be a topic about a situation that happens in the Philippines when people try to be clever with the law and where it can come back at you and bite you hard. Now, I'm sure you can guess what I'm talking about here. We're talking about ending up with dodgy documents that come back and bite you hard when it comes to a visa application, due to people being a little bit casual about legal matters. Anyway, I'll continue. The dangers of generalising Filipino matters. Continuing on, one person who had experienced paperwork dealings in the Philippines before on this Facebook group made a comment about how Filipinos get into trouble by listening to older people more than by listening to a foreigner, and how this is especially prevalent amongst the poorly educated. Well, before you know it, a few Filipinos got up in arms about this and how there were many educated Filipinos and how important education is in the Philippines. So I got offended by pointing out that, well, yes, there are lots of wonderfully well-educated Filipinos, but there are those who are not quite as well educated and, live in insular little worlds. So, that's the point there. So, here was this poor fellow left trying to explain himself and to defend himself. He'd upset some Filipinos who thought he was being derogatory and condescending to the Philippines nation as a whole, and were no doubt taking it very personally, as though he was saying, you're Filipino, so therefore you are poorly educated, which he most definitely was not doing. The Filipinos, they had gone on the defensive. In this case, I don't think they were justified, because on the whole, what the man said was quite correct. Filipinos, like a lot of family-oriented countries, they respect their elders, and it's normal for older people, whether that's sisters, brothers, aunts, uncles, etc., to give guidance to younger people, and it's normal for those younger people to listen. Now, where it goes wrong is when the older person is less than principled and uses the age advantage to unfairly influence someone, or where the older person, with the best of intentions, simply gives advice about topics they know absolutely nothing about. Now, we come across this problem at Down Under Visa when we give some advice based on our knowledge and experience, only to find it overturned by an auntie somewhere who tells them to do something different. Memory takes me to a partner visa refusal where an auntie had told the lady not to tell her fiancé about her 4 kids. She said, no man will ever accept you as 4 kids, so tell them you don't have any. And that's what she did, and he went there, he saw these kids hanging around and just thought they were somebody else's kids. It wasn't very good when the embassy found out. The embassy are very good at finding things out, rest assured, but anyway, that's not what this topic is about. A silly thing in that particular case was, when it came down to it and I was explaining the situation to him, he said if she had have just told me, it would have been fine. But, messed everything up by doing so. But anyway, the point there was that, Auntie no doubt thought she knew best, and she felt it was her role to give that advice, and her niece said, "Oh, well, Auntie's told me, well then, geez, I better do it then," and well, yeah, it went horribly wrong because she did that. So yes, nobody can or should say that this doesn't happen. It does happen, and yes, it can cause quite large problems. So, whilst I'm generalising when I warn clients to watch out for helpful relatives giving unqualified advice or about wrong information on documents due to another national characteristic about not being especially particular about correct spelling and dates, I don't do it to be insulting. I do it to help and avoid mistakes that can lead to visa refusals. If I'm too careful about what I say, I may as well close my doors. I can't not tell people these things. I can't, we have a practice where if something doesn't look quite right, for example, somebody does a questionnaire and they put down they have no siblings. Yeah, it happens. We get the occasional only child, but most of the time, if you say, "I notice you have not listed any siblings, is this correct?" They go, "Oh, do I have to put them down?" And then, yes, they do, because it's a fairly generalising thing here to say that it's not that unusual for Filipinos to have large families, far more so than it is in Australia. So it's not insulting anybody to generalise in that way. It's just being careful. Okay, so, but yeah, anyway, we have to be honest and open about things. Now, the odd thing about the Filipinos who were offended when they thought an Australian was insulting them was that one of them came back to say that the problem with The problem with Westerners living in the Philippines is that they think they are above and far better than the locals. And another Filipino came back and said that a lot of Westerners commit crimes in the Philippines and then skip bail. At the time I thought, well, this is a bit of a strange response after criticising somebody for typecasting and generalising, and a whole lot harsher, to say, all the problem with Westerners, not the problem with some Westerners, but the problem with Westerners is that they think they are above and far better than the locals. So that's saying every Westerner is incredibly arrogant and thinks they're superior to Filipinos. And to say a lot of Westerners commit crimes in the Philippines and then skip bail. Okay, I'm a Westerner living in the Philippines. I'm not arrogant and I don't look down on locals, and I certainly don't commit crimes and then skip bail. I'm a good boy. But yeah, so I thought that was considerably harsher, but a bit of a double standard there. But this is the point I'm getting to. Australia and the Philippines, both former colonies. Australians and Filipinos, whilst very different in many ways, we seem to get on very well as a rule. We tend to be both warm and friendly, and we're fairly informal and earthy. We're not Filipinos are people who sit around at home dressed casually. They walk around outside with bellies showing and various things like that. Australians, same thing. We don't put on a suit to go and mow the lawn. We're fairly relaxed, we're fairly informal, we're fairly earthy. And one thing we both have in common is that our nations were both gained independence from foreign powers in the 20th century. Yes, both former colonies. The Filipinos were a colony of Spain for many hundreds of years, then became a colony of America. When was it, 1947? So forgive me if I'm incorrect, but I think that was the year that Philippines gained independence. So, Australia got independence from the British. That was in, goodness, forgive me if I got this wrong, I think 1901. Yeah, neither of us won independence by driving the enemy into the sea and battle. Our former rulers continued their influence to this day. That's a fact. America still has a very strong influence here in the Philippines. I've looked at old pictures of Manila in the 1960s, 1950s, and half of everybody you saw on the street were uniformed American servicemen. So it hasn't been that long since Clark Air Force Base and Subic Bay Naval Base was closed down. And there's a very large American embassy right there on Rojas Boulevard where they will arrest people for taking photographs. So yes, America still has a very strong influence here. And the same in with England and Australia. I grew up in the 1970s when God Save the Queen was our national anthem. So these do still influence us. And we both seem to get fairly easily offended when our nations are criticised. I guess we either feel inferior sometimes or we feel that other people think that we're inferior. Yes, we both get overly defensive, and sometimes this is to our detriment. The fact is Australia is not perfect, and neither is the Philippines. Unless we're prepared to admit a few faults and areas where we could improve, well, guess what? We won't improve. Now, it's one of the areas that I admire the British for. You can criticise anything about their country and their culture to them, and they may even agree with you. They almost never take it personally, because, why would they? I mean, these things happen to be facts. Again, Australia is riddled with faults. So is the Philippines. It's human nature. None of us are perfect. I think we all know that. With this defensiveness, it exists in both our nation's psyches, and as sensitive spouses and partners, we should do what we can not to hurt each other. Now, in a healthy Australian Filipino marriage, everything should be open to free discussion, but at the same time, we should avoid hurting each other. Okay, we should not have areas where we say, you cannot bring this topic up, you cannot discuss this. But yes, at the same time, we need to be sensitive, and we shouldn't be, go savagely in and make harsh comments if that's going to cause hurt. Okay. Now, the really wrong type of generalising. Now, I occasionally get comments made on blog articles which are really offensive, and I delete them to ensure the writers never get a broad audience. These are the men who make the all Filipinos are gold diggers and you can't trust them generalising comments. Some Filipinos are gold diggers and will scam Australian men for money. I've come across them personally. I'm sure many of you have, but I still came back and I found a good woman, and well, here I am. So yes, some Filipinos are gold diggers and will scam Australian men for money. That's a fact. Some Australian men are also addicted to porn. Some will beat up their wives. Some are alcoholics. But it's not fair to say that all or most Australians behave like that. It's also not right to say Filipinos are uneducated, or to say most foreigners think they're better than Filipinos. Judging all because of the behaviour of a minority, now that's about as unintelligent as it gets. And you watch out for anyone in my presence who says anything offensive about all Filipinos, because that includes my wife. And they won't even get time to worry about my wife overreacting, because I'll be doing enough for both of us. Fact. But, judging an entire nation and an entire people because of a negative trait experience, this is just another form of racism. And in some cases it's, oh goodness me, I mean, if a man comes here and, thinks thinks with the wrong head, as it were, and ends up getting himself scammed. Well, he should be, as part of that blame should rest with him. And I guess a woman who will marry the first man who comes along, who doesn't wait to see, is she in love with him because she just wants to, get out of the country. Well, that's not a very bright thing to do either. So, as I said, to do that is just another form of racism. It's racism whether it's directed at Filipinos or delivered at Australians. Racism is particularly destructive when it doesn't give an individual a chance or an opportunity. When you shut everybody, you shut out, the entire Filipino populace because of what somebody did, or if you, write off all Australians because of what somebody did. A lot of the bars and what have you in Angeles City, for example, I find it embarrassing that a lot of them are run by Australians. But goodness me, I don't run girly bars, and I never would. It's just not my nature. But yes, I'll say that again. Racism is particularly destructive because it doesn't give an individual a chance or an opportunity. Now, whether that's someone assuming the Filipino wife of a neighbour must have married him for his money, or to assume that the white man who made an observation about a Filipino habit must be asserting his sense of superiority rather than considering he may have a valid point, that is destructive and that is grossly unfair. It also means you won't learn anything. This is the point. Whatever it is that we think or believe, if we're honest with ourselves, we should be prepared to lay it all open on the table and, let it be open to scrutiny. And then, if it holds up, well, good. Hang on to it. But, sometimes we find, well, goodness me, I was wrong about that, and time to change it. So, it's an intelligent thing to do, to allow yourself to be open to constructive criticism. Actually, Australians these days are generally a pretty accepting lot, and we're fairly easily won over by warmth and friendliness. Most Filipinos are welcomed fairly quickly as new Australians. We weren't always that way, but thankfully those days are long gone, and today's migrating Filipinos will never know anything other than a warm welcome in Australia. Australia, a multicultural society made up of migrants, and by and large we know that and we do appreciate that. That is the Australian way. Now, for myself, I like to think I retain the Australian values and thinking that I choose to retain, and to keep my mind open to those better ways of doing things that my home of the last nearly 9 years has exposed me to. Nearly 9 years. Goodness me, when did we come? Nearly 9 years. And I hope that those in Australian Filipino relationships can keep their minds open, especially to each other. Thanks very much. Well, that brings us to the end of another episode of the Down Under Visa Philippines to Australia podcast series. Thank you very much for joining us. We hope you enjoyed and we hope you found this useful. Australian visas from the Philippines are not easy and the outcome matters, as you well know. Please feel free to contact us anytime if you need some further help. And we look forward to talking to you again next time. Bye-bye.